The cowboy's life had been defined by silence long before the day fate came to knock at his door. He had ridden far from the towns where music spilled from saloons and men laughed over whiskey. He had left behind the dusty trails where cattle were driven and coins were exchanged with the sound of clinking spurs. Out on the edge of the frontier, where land stretched wide and seemed endless beneath the sky, he built himself a cabin from rough timber and stone. It was not much to look at: 4 walls, a roof that creaked when the wind was harsh, and a hearth that gave light when the nights were longer than his patience. Yet for him, it was enough. His only companion was his horse, a steady chestnut mare, with a mane that tangled in the prairie winds. She was not fast, not the kind men boasted of in gambling halls, but she was loyal. She never strayed too far, never failed him on the rough paths, and her steady breath was often the only sound he heard in weeks of loneliness. Some nights, when the silence weighed heavy, he would find himself speaking aloud to her words meant for no one, drifting into the open air. She would flick her ears, stamp a hoof, or nuzzle his shoulder, as if she understood. And in a way, she did. The cowboy was a man of few words, but his silence was not born of peace. It was carved from scars. Once, he had been a younger man who laughed louder, who drank harder, who rode in company with others. But the frontier has a way of stripping men bare, of reminding them of losses more permanent than the setting sun. He had buried too many dreams beneath the hard soil of the West, friends who had never returned from raids, a brother lost in the fevered grip of illness, and a love whose memory he no longer dared to touch for fear of reopening the wound. The cabin, for all its loneliness, was safer than remembering. The days were all the same, painted in muted colors by repetition. He rose with the sun, drew water from the well he had dug with his own blistered hands, and tended to the horse. He mended fences, checked traps for small game, and cut wood for the fire. In the evenings, he sat on the small porch with a pipe between his lips, watching the sky deepen into shades of gold and purple before surrendering to the night. Sometimes coyotes sang in the distance, their howls lonely cousins to his own silence. The prairie wind carried stories he could not hear, and the stars above stretched infinite, uncaring of the small man who sat beneath them. He had grown used to the rhythm of this existence. Days slipped into weeks, weeks into months, and the passing years left only deeper grooves in his face and roughness in his hands. He thought he had made peace with it, this exile, this self-imposed solitude. Yet peace is fragile. It cracks with the slightest tremor, and sometimes, without warning, the world decides a man cannot remain hidden. That evening, the world decided. The day had been warm, though the wind carried a faint bite, a whisper of the cold season that lurked not far off. The cowboy had finished mending a section of fence and was brushing the dust from his clothes when the sun began to dip. It sank slowly at first, painting the sky with streaks of fire. Red bled into orange, orange into purple, until the whole horizon looked aflame. He leaned against the porch post, pipe glowing faintly in his hand, and watched it fade. He thought, as he often did, that the end of a day felt like the closing of a chapter no one would ever read. But then sound. At first, it was faint, no louder than the distant rustle of grass in the wind. He might have ignored it, chalked it up to his tired mind or the restless movements of a rabbit. Yet as he listened, his hand stilling halfway to his mouth, the sound sharpened. Footsteps, fast, uneven, hurry different from the steady rhythm of a man walking with purpose or the confident stride of a hunter. These were desperate steps, quick and stumbling, the kind made by someone running not toward something, but away. His hand dropped to the rifle propped against the porch wall. Habit, reflex. In the frontier, footsteps in the dusk were rarely good news. He moved silently to the edge of the porch, eyes narrowed against the fading light. The sky's last colors threw long shadows across the land, stretching them like dark fingers. And in those shadows, he saw it, a small figure, for a heartbeat. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. Out here, at this hour, so far from town, he expected a drifter, a thief, perhaps even a wounded man, staggering for aid. But no, the figure was too small, too fragile, too unsteady. A child. The boy stumbled across the dry grass, his thin legs trembling beneath him. His bare feet struck the ground as though they had long grown numb to pain. Dust clung to his skin, and his clothes, if they could even be called that, were no more than rags, torn and hanging loose, barely shielding him from the evening chill. In one hand, he clutched a scrap of cloth, pressed tightly to his chest as though it were treasure or lifeline. His eyes, dark, wide, and glistening, searched wildly as though shadows chased him. Shadows only he could see. The cowboy froze. His first thought was disbelief. What was a child doing here, alone, at this hour? His second thought was sharper, cutting through him like cold steel. The boy is running from something, and if he was running, something dangerous was not far behind. The footsteps faltered as the child neared the cabin. He tripped once, caught himself, tripped again. When he finally reached the porch, he collapsed against the steps, chest heaving, breath ragged. The cowboy moved before he thought, crouching down, his shadow falling over the small frame. The boy flinched as though expecting a blow, but the cowboy only held out a hand. The child's fingers were small, trembling, cold despite the warm evening. The cowboy helped him up gently, noting the way the boy's eyes refused to look away. From the darkening horizon, fear had rooted itself deep in him, not the momentary fright of a child who had wandered too far, but the bone-deep terror of one who had fled for his life. When their eyes finally met, the cowboy's heart shifted. In his chest, the boy's gaze was not only afraid, it was pleading. As if, without words, he was begging the cowboy to keep him hidden, to shield him from the shadows gathering just beyond the fading light. And though the cowboy did not yet know who the boy was or what danger stalked him, or why fate had chosen this night, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: the world had just broken his silence. The presence of the boy inside that lonely frontier cabin was like lightning splitting the night sky, a sudden, impossible brilliance that both terrified and awakened the cowboy. For years, his world had been measured in simple rhythms: the crunch of his boots on gravel, the soft snort of his horse, the groan of timber when the wind pressed against the cabin walls. Words had been absent, conversation extinct. Silence had been his chosen companion, a shield against memories too sharp to revisit. But now, in the doorway of his seclusion, a child stood trembling, and with that single fragile presence, his solitude cracked apart like thin ice beneath unexpected weight. The boy had not spoken, not yet. He did not need to. His very body told the story of desperation. The cowboy's eyes moved over the child, mud streaked across thin legs, scratches etched into his skin, hair matted by sweat and dust, and clothes so torn they looked ready to dissolve in the wind. But it was not these things that struck the cowboy deepest. It was the way the boy's arms locked around the scrap of cloth he carried, as if letting it go meant surrendering his very soul. The cloth was worn, frayed at the edges, its original color long since faded. To anyone else, it would appear worthless. But to this boy, it was a lifeline, clutched so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. "Come inside," the cowboy said. Though his voice startled even himself, the words came out hoarse, brittle from disuse, the syllables carrying the weight of months, perhaps years, without speech. His throat burned with the effort, and he coughed, realizing with a pang how long it had been since another human ear had heard his voice. The boy startled at the sound, eyes wide and cautious, as though unsure whether to trust the figure towering over him. But desperation outweighed hesitation. Slowly, silently, he obeyed. The cowboy guided him over the threshold, his hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. He was careful not to grip too firmly, careful not to mirror whatever harshness the boy might have fled from. The cabin door groaned as he shut it against the wind, sealing them into the dim interior where firelight cast trembling shadows across the wooden walls. The room was sparse, nearly bare: a table with 2 chairs, one seldom used, a shelf with a few books, their pages yellowing, a bed pushed against the wall, its blanket neatly folded from years of habit rather than comfort. Everything about the place spoke of a life lived in retreat, pared down to necessity. And now, in the middle of it all, the boy's presence felt like a disruption so profound that the air itself seemed thicker. The cowboy motioned for the boy to sit at the table. The child hesitated, clutching his cloth tighter, his gaze darting around the cabin as if searching for threats. He moved like a hunted animal, every muscle taut, every step tentative. Finally, he lowered himself onto the chair, his legs too short for his feet to touch the ground. They dangled there, swinging faintly, a small reminder of how impossibly young he was to be carrying such fear. The cowboy crouched across from him. Resting his forearms on the table, he studied the boy in silence, knowing better than to press him for words too soon. Silence, after all, was something he understood intimately. And yet, the silence now was different from the one that had filled the cabin for years. This silence was alive, fragile, waiting to be broken. The boy's eyes flicked to him only briefly before returning to the cloth in his hands. He held it, tighter still, his knuckles whitening, his jaw trembling. The cowboy leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but steady despite its roughness. "You're safe here," he said. The words were simple, but even as he spoke them, he wondered if they were true. Out on the frontier, safety was never more than a temporary illusion. But for this moment, within these walls, it was the only promise he could offer. The boy didn't respond. His lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. His chest rose and fell too quickly, breaths shallow with the remnants of panic. The cowboy remembered fear, like that deep clenching, the kind that made words impossible. He reached across the table slowly, deliberately, not toward the boy's hands, but toward a tin cup sitting nearby. He poured water from a pitcher and slid the cup gently across the table. The boy's eyes followed the motion, suspicious at first, then desperate. He snatched the cup with trembling hands and drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. When he finished, he set it down with care, as though afraid it might be taken from him. The cowboy let the silence stretch a moment longer before speaking again. "What's your name?" The question hung in the air. The boy's eyes flickered, his lips moving faintly, but no answer came. Instead, he gripped the cloth so tightly that the cowboy feared it might tear. The scrap of fabric seemed to anchor him, his entire identity woven into those worn threads. The cowboy's gaze softened. Whatever the cloth was, it mattered. Perhaps it was the only thing he had left of where he came from, the only proof of a world that still claimed him. The cowboy did not press. He had learned long ago that some truths cannot be forced, they must be given. When the soul is ready, as the minutes passed, the cowboy realized something that unsettled him more than the boy's silence. He felt protective, fiercely so. It was a strange, almost forgotten instinct, one he thought he had buried along with the life he had left behind. For years, he had believed himself incapable of caring for anyone beyond his horse and the ghosts of memory. But this boy, fragile and trembling, had stepped across his threshold, and with him came a responsibility the cowboy could neither deny nor escape. Two strangers sat facing each other in that dim cabin, one, a man who had chosen silence, who had exiled himself from the noise and pain of humanity, and one, a child who carried secrets too heavy for such small shoulders. They did not yet share names, nor trust, nor understanding. But in that fragile moment, as wind pressed against the walls and firelight flickered across their faces, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that fate had bound them together, and neither solitude nor fear would ever be the same again. The night seemed endless, dragging itself across the hours in a silence thick enough to smother breath. Yet it was not true silence, not anymore. For years, the cowboy's nights had been carved from stillness, the kind that crept into his bones, and made him feel more ghost than man. But now, in the small cabin with its weary wooden walls and its dim, flickering firelight, silence had changed its nature. It was no longer absence, but presence heavy, filled with the weight of questions that lingered unsaid between the cowboy and the boy. He lit the fire with slow, deliberate motions, stacking kindling in the hearth, striking the flint, coaxing sparks until flame caught and spread. The fire cracked to life, spitting embers like stars into the darkness. The sound was sharp, comforting in its way, though it carried a restless edge, like the nervous tapping of fingers on a tabletop. The boy's eyes followed the flame, wide and unblinking, as though afraid it might vanish if he looked away. His small body hunched forward, closer to its warmth, his hands still locked around the scrap of cloth. Neither spoke. The cowboy felt words pressing at the back of his throat, but he swallowed them down, choosing instead to watch the way the light shifted across the boy's face. In the glow of the fire, the child's features looked both fragile and fierce, cheekbones sharp from hunger, jaw trembling from exhaustion, eyes filled with something older than his years, fear, yes, but also defiance, a refusal to break despite whatever storm had battered him before arriving here. Outside, the wind rose. It howled across the plains, a wild, untamed thing, rushing through the cracks in the cabin walls, making the shutters rattle like loose bones. It was a sound the cowboy knew well. For 10 long years, he had listened to that same wind, unchallenged by human voices, untempered by laughter or song. But tonight, it sounded different. It carried menace, or perhaps warning, as though the earth itself knew that the arrival of this child had shifted something in the balance of things. The boy sat stiffly at first, every creak of the cabin making him flinch. His eyes darted to the window whenever the shutters clapped against the frame, to the door whenever the wind pressed hard enough to make it groan. Slowly, though, warmth worked its way into his body, softening his rigid posture. His eyelids fluttered once, twice, heavy with exhaustion. He fought it, trying to keep them open, but the weight of fatigue pressed too insistently. At last, his small frame sagged, his head tipping sideways, cheek resting against the edge of the table. The cloth remained clutched tight against his chest, his fingers refusing to release it even in sleep. His breaths came unevenly at first, shallow gasps, still tainted by the echo of fear. Then gradually, like the settling of a storm, they deepened, smoothing into the soft, uneven rhythm of a child who has surrendered. However, briefly, to rest. The cowboy did not move him. He simply watched, feeling a strange ache in his chest he hadn't known in years. There was a tenderness to the sight that unsettled him. He had seen men die in battle without flinching. He had buried friends without tears. Yet the simple image of a child fallen asleep at his table, holding a scrap of cloth as though it were the anchor of his world, stirred something inside him that he thought long dead. The fire burned low, shadows thickening around the edges of the room. The cowboy leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the flames. They shifted and curled, rising and collapsing in endless cycles. Like the life he had lived, brief sparks of brightness swallowed by inevitable dark. He thought of the boy again, wondering what storm of cruelty or desperation had driven him to this doorstep. Alone, ragged, silent, children did not wander the wilderness by chance. Something or someone had pushed him out into the teeth of the frontier. The cowboy's thoughts spiraled with unease. He had no illusions. Whatever fate had dropped this child into his care, it would not be without consequence. Men did not arrive alone in such condition. If there were pursuers, they might already be near. If there was a family, they might come searching, or worse, if there were enemies, they might soon follow the boy's trail straight to this cabin. The wind howled again, louder now, making the shutters bang violently. The boy stirred in his sleep, his hand tightening around the cloth, a whimper escaping his lips. The cowboy reached out instinctively, steadying the cup of water on the table before it could tip, his eyes flicking toward the door. Every instinct born of survival sharpened. Inside him, he had lived too long in solitude not to recognize the signs of coming danger. His gut told him this was no ordinary night. And yet, despite the unease, he did not regret letting the boy inside. For the first time in a decade, there was someone in his cabin that made the silence bearable, even meaningful. He felt the old weight of solitude crack further, replaced with something he dared not name: responsibility, perhaps even hope. Hours crawled past. The cowboy remained awake, his eyes never leaving the fire. He fed it wood sparingly, careful to keep the flames steady, a reminder to himself that the world had not gone dark. He stared into those flames, searching for answers in their chaotic dance, wondering what kind of storm had truly delivered this child to his doorend, what kind of greater storm might soon break upon them both. By the time dawn threatened at the horizon, the cowboy's eyes were dry, his mind restless. The boy still slept, cloth in hand, the faint glow of embers flickering across his small face. And the cowboy, though sleepless, understood one truth with absolute clarity: the arrival of this child had changed his road forever. There would be no going back to silence, no returning to solitude. Danger was coming, and with it, the demand for courage he had long abandoned. The first breath of dawn crept across the horizon, slow and deliberate, as though the earth itself hesitated to unveil the day. The prairie stretched out like an endless ocean, its rolling grasses painted in shades of muted gold and soft, shadow-drenched blues. The rising sun kissed the land with light that seemed both gentle and merciless, gentle in its warmth, merciless in how it revealed every detail of the world. The scars of old wagon ruts, the bleached bones of long-dead animals, the lonely sprawl of wilderness that promised both beauty and danger in equal measure. From inside the cabin, the cowboy watched that light spill across the land through the cracks in the shutters. It was a sight he had not tired of in all his years of solitude, though it had often mocked him with its indifferent beauty. The prairie at dawn was vast, endless, untouchable. He, by contrast, had been just a man confined to a small cabin, a prisoner of his own past, watching the sunrise without anyone to share it with. But today, dawn felt different. Today, there was another heartbeat in the cabin, another pair of eyes that would open to see the day. The boy stirred before the fire fully died. His small body shifted against the rough wooden table, his head lifting slowly as though the weight of the night clung to him still. His lashes fluttered, and then his eyes cracked open, dark, sharp, alive with that same flickering wariness that had burned there the night before. He blinked at the cabin walls, at the fire's fading embers, and then, instinctively, his gaze shot toward the door. The cowboy followed that glance, understanding it before he even questioned it. Fear lived in that look, not the ordinary kind that children carried with them when they awoke in strange places, but the kind etched deep, born of experience, of trauma. It was the gaze of someone who had learned to expect danger waiting just outside, pressing against doors, hunting for cracks through which to slip in. The cowboy had seen that look before on the faces of men in war, men who woke in the night not to peace but to the memory of enemies. And now, he saw it in a child no older than 5 or 6. The cowboy did not speak. He had never been quick with words, and even if he had, he knew language was too fragile a tool to break through the kind of fear the boy carried. Instead, he moved with deliberate slowness, every gesture steady, unthreatening. He took up the tin cup from the shelf, filled it with clear water from the jug, and set it down gently on the table before the boy. The sound of metal against wood rang quietly in the small room, a sound that, for all its simplicity, felt profound in the silence. The boy's eyes flicked to the cup, then back to the cowboy. His fingers twitched, loosening from the cloth he still clutched as though it were a lifeline. He hesitated, suspicion and need warring across his small face. Hunger could be ignored for a time. Pain could be endured. But thirst was different at last. Slowly, he reached forward, his small hand trembling as it wrapped around the cup. He lifted it to his lips, drank, then paused as if expecting the water to burn. It did not. He drank again, longer this time, draining the cup until only the faintest sheen of liquid clung to the bottom. The cowboy refilled it without a word. The boy drank again. For several moments, that was all water passing from jug to cup to the boy's lips, the fire crackling in its death throes, the wind pressing faintly against the shutters as the morning grew brighter. And yet, in that silence, something shifted. It was not grand or dramatic. It was small, fragile, but real. The boy's eyes no longer darted toward the door with every creak of the cabin. His shoulders, though still tense, had eased by the smallest fraction, and the cowboy, watching, felt that easing as though it were a gift offered to him alone. Trust, not the kind born of words, nor the kind sealed with promises. This was the trust of survival, the instinctive recognition that in this moment, in this place, the man before him meant no harm. It was tenuous, delicate, like a spider's thread stretched across a canyon. But it was there, shining faintly in the growing light. The cowboy leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting again to the shuttered window. Outside, the prairie gleamed with morning. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. Its voice carried, on the wind. Danger still lived out there. He could feel it, the way an old soldier feels the coming of battle before it begins. But here, within these four walls, there was something else, something he had not expected. A bond had begun to form, not with words, not even with touch, but with the quiet, unspoken act of one soul offering what little it had to another. The boy set the cup down carefully, almost reverently, and held the cloth to his chest again. His eyes found the cowboy's for a brief second. It was not gratitude yet, nor relief, but it was softer than before, less wild, less hunted. The cowboy gave a single, slow nod. Nothing needed to be said. The sun rose higher, washing the cabin in golden light. And though the world beyond remained both beautiful and dangerous, within those wooden walls, for the first time in a long while, there was the faint promise of something else, the promise of trust. The silence inside the cabin was not an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that breathed, that carried weight, that spoke louder than words ever could. The cowboy sat very still in his chair, one weathered hand resting lightly on his knee, the other dangling loosely by his side. He did not move toward the boy. He did not speak. He did not reach out, for he knew better than most men that some things could not be rushed, and some fears could not be pushed aside with the comfort of words. Words were fragile things, easy to say and easier to break. What he needed in that moment was not words, but patience, deep as the prairie and steady as the mountains beyond the horizon. He watched the boy, and he understood. The child's every breath seemed measured, as if even the act of drawing air into his lungs carried risk. His small body was stiff, his shoulders hunched protectively, his thin fingers still gripping that strip of cloth against his chest, like a shield. His eyes, though, were the truest window. They told the cowboy everything he needed to know. They were the eyes of something hunted, of something that had learned never to trust what approached too quickly. Those eyes reminded him of wild mustangs he had seen on the plains, creatures that ran at the mere shadow of a man, that would break their own bodies before allowing themselves to be cornered. The cowboy had spent years around horses. He had broken them, trained them, healed them, and, when necessary, simply let them go. And in that time, he had learned that the wildest among them could never be conquered with rope or spur. They could only be reached with patience, with gentleness, with a steady hand that never struck, and a presence that never wavered. It was about proving, moment after moment, hour after hour, that you meant no harm, until at last the animal would take one step closer, instead of one step back. That was what he saw, now not in a horse, but in this boy. The moment was fragile. He could feel it as sharply as he could feel the edge of a blade. The air itself seemed brittle, as though one wrong gesture might splinter it into 1,000 shards. If he moved too quickly, the boy might recoil, drawing deeper into himself, shutting the door to any chance of trust. If he spoke too soon, even a kind word might sound like thunder in the boy's ears, startling him into silence. He understood this balance instinctively, the way a man understands the weight of a loaded gun or the tension in a taut rope. The wrong step, and the fragile thing before him would shatter, so he stayed still. He allowed the silence to stretch, not as something to fear, but as something to inhabit. His patience became its own kind of language, one that did not need words. He made his movements deliberate, slow, easy to read. When he shifted in his chair, it was with the gentleness of a man easing a saddle onto a nervous colt. When he adjusted his hat, it was in silence. No sudden jerks, no sharp sounds. He drank from his own cup of water, showing the boy by example that there was nothing to fear in the act. Every gesture was a message. You are safe. I am not your enemy. I will not harm you. The boy's eyes remained locked on him, wary and sharp, as though searching for the hidden danger that must surely lie beneath the surface. And yet, slowly, imperceptibly, those eyes began to soften. It was not surrender. Not yet. It was not even true trust, but for the briefest breath, the fear eased. His grip on the cloth loosened ever so slightly, his shoulders tense as bowstrings, dipped by a fraction of an inch. The cowboy noticed. He always noticed the smallest changes, because in moments like these, the smallest changes meant everything. It was not victory, it was not a promise, but it was a seed, the tiniest seed planted in soil, still thick with ash and shadow, a seed of safety. And the cowboy knew what seeds required. They needed time, they needed care, they needed to be protected from the cold winds and the sharp hooves of those who would crush them. A single careless act could snuff out that seed before it ever had a chance to take root. But given patience, given gentleness, it could grow into something strong enough to weather the storm. As he watched that flicker of softness cross the boy's face, the cowboy felt something stir within himself, to something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long, long time. It was not hope, not exactly. Hope was too grand a word, too fragile for a man who had lived alone with nothing but ghosts for a decade. It was something quieter, something smaller but more enduring. It was the sense that maybe, just maybe, the long years of silence had led him to this moment for a reason, that maybe the world had not finished with him yet. The boy looked down, avoiding his eyes once more, but the cowboy did not mind. He knew the boy's fear would not vanish in a night, nor in a day. Trust, once broken, was slower to mend than the deepest wound. But he had time, he had patience, and for the first time in 10 long years, he had someone to be patient for. The sun climbed higher outside, painting the cabin walls with light. Dust floated in the beams, tiny golden motes drifting like sparks from a dying fire. And in that fragile, golden quiet, a bond had begun it forged with fire or hammered with steel, but planted softly, invisibly, in the silence between a broken child and a weathered man. Neither spoke, neither needed to. For the first time, safety had taken root. The world outside the cabin was vast, unforgiving, and mercilessly open. It stretched out in every direction like a sea of dust and grass, its silence broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk or the whisper of wind skimming over the plains. It was a land that swallowed men whole, a land where the strong survived not by kindness but by grit, by endurance, and often by cruelty. For years, the cowboy had walked it alone, his life stitched together from solitude and survival, with nothing tethering him to the earth but the rhythm of his own heartbeat and the memory of voices long gone. But inside the cabin, a shift had taken place, quiet yet undeniable. The walls were the same rough timber, the air, the same mixture of smoke, dust, and faint pine resin. Yet it no longer felt like the hollow shelter of one man's loneliness. Something had changed. The presence of the boy, the fragile curve of his frame, the wary gleam of his eyes, the way he breathed like someone who had forgotten how to alter the very air within those walls. The cabin was no longer just a hiding place against the elements, it had become something else, a refuge. The boy himself had crossed an invisible threshold in that moment. Hours ago, he had been nothing more than a fugitive, a hunted creature fleeing from shadows too large for his small body to outrun. His steps had been desperate, his breaths ragged, his every movement dictated by fear. He had arrived at the cowboy's door as nothing more than a scrap of life clinging to itself, a fragment of a story that no one had cared to hear. But now the boy was no longer simply running. He was no longer merely a fugitive. He was a child under protection, sheltered by a man who asked for nothing in return, who expected no reward, who demanded no explanation. And that simple act of shelter, of choosing to shield instead of turning away, changed everything. For a boy who had known only pursuit and danger, to be watched over without condition was a revolution of the heart. The cabin did not erase the scars of his fear. It did not silence the echoes of the footsteps that had chased him across the plains. But it gave him something he had not felt in what must have been years. The first fragile suggestion of safety. It gave him a chance to breathe without expecting every sound to be the strike of doom. It gave him a moment where his existence was not reduced to survival, but acknowledged as something worth protecting. The cowboy asked nothing of him. That was the miracle of it. He did not press the boy for answers, did not pry into the mysteries of who he was or what had driven him to the edge of collapse. He did not set conditions or bargains. His protection was not a transaction but a gift. And in that silence, the boy's sense of self began to tremble back to life, like the faint spark of a fire struggling against the ashes of a long night. But the cabin was not the end of this story. The boy did not know it, and the cowboy himself perhaps only sensed it dimly, like the way a man can feel the storm building beyond the horizon long before the first thunder breaks. Beyond those walls, the world was not still. Far across the plains and forests, 500 native voices carried a weight of waiting. They were already stirring, bound not just by blood to the child but by the silent law of gratitude that moved through their people like lifeblood itself. 500 voices, 500 hearts, 500 souls who would rise as one when the truth reached them that a stranger, a lone cowboy, forgotten by the world, had chosen to protect one of their own when he could just as easily have turned him away. It was a gratitude that would not be measured in words alone, but in the kind of devotion that could shift the balance of lives. It was already on its way, though neither the cowboy nor the boy yet knew it. For now, it was only a cabin, only two souls joined by circumstance, and only the faintest hint of trust beginning to root itself in the shadows of fear. But destiny is never loud at first. It whispers. It plants itself in the smallest gestures: an open door, a steady silence, a refusal to let fear dictate cruelty. It grows from those moments until one day the world tilts on its axis, and nothing is ever the same again. Outside, the land remained, vast and unyielding, a place that had tested men to their limits and broken more spirits than it had spared. But inside that cabin, a quiet rebellion had taken shape. The rebellion of care against indifference, of protection against pursuit, of humanity against the void. And though no one could hear it yet, 500 voices were already preparing to rise, voices that would echo like thunder across the plains, carrying with them a single truth, A stranger had saved a child, and for that, a nation would never forget.